From the very beginning, before stone touched stone, and before a single wall rose above the shoreline, Winfield Hall carried an atmosphere that was difficult to explain, and even harder to ignore. The land itself seemed uneasy, as if it resisted the idea of permanence. Locals spoke of the area in lowered voices, not because of any legend written down, but because of a feeling, a subtle pressure that made people uneasy without offering a clear reason. This was not the kind of place where a peaceful summer residence naturally belonged. It was too exposed, too raw, and too heavy with silence. When construction was announced, it sounded less like a celebration and more like a declaration of defiance. The scale was excessive even by the standards of America's most ambitious families. The plan was not merely to build a house, but to impose order, grandeur, and symbolism onto a landscape that had never asked for it. Winfield Hall was designed to dominate its surroundings, to stand as a visible statement of power, wealth, and permanence. Yet, from the first days, that intention felt strangely misplaced, as though the building itself rejected the role assigned to it. Workers described an odd tension on the site. Tools went missing, measurements were redone again and again, and small mistakes accumulated into costly delays. None of it was dramatic enough to halt construction, but together these incidents formed a pattern that was impossible to fully dismiss. The house resisted precision. Plans that looked flawless on paper felt awkward when translated into stone and steel. Hallways stretched too long, ceilings pressed down where they should have inspired awe, and the symmetry, so carefully calculated, felt unsettling rather than harmonious. Architecturally, Winfield Hall borrowed heavily from European palaces, but something essential was lost in the translation. The proportions were technically correct, yet emotionally cold. Rooms felt staged rather than lived in, as if they were waiting for occupants who would never quite arrive. Even in its unfinished state, the mansion gave the impression of being a monument rather than a home, a place designed to impress from the outside while remaining strangely hollow within. There was also the matter of timing. The era was marked by optimism on the surface, but anxiety beneath it. Industrial wealth was expanding rapidly, and families competed not only in fortune but in visibility. Winfield Hall was born out of this competition, a structure meant to outshine neighbors and secure a place in history. But that urgency came at a cost. The mansion was conceived too quickly, driven by ambition rather than patience, and built as though time itself were an adversary that needed to be defeated. Even those who admired the project sensed an imbalance. Visitors standing near the rising structure often remarked that it felt older than it should have, as if it belonged to a different moment, or perhaps to no moment at all. The building did not grow naturally from the land. It appeared imposed upon it, like an answer to a question no one had asked. The closer it came to completion, the more it resembled a warning disguised as luxury. And then, just as the mansion was beginning to take shape, the event occurred that would permanently alter its story. A sudden blaze tore through the structure, erasing months of work in a matter of hours. It was not merely a setback, it felt like a verdict. Flames moved with unnatural speed, consuming sections that were thought to be secure, leaving behind a skeletal reminder of how fragile the entire vision truly was. Observers spoke less about damage and more about inevitability, as though the fire had revealed something that had been present from the start. To understand why Winfield Hall always felt wrong, why its very existence seemed strained and uneasy, one must return to that moment. The fire was not just an accident in the timeline of construction, it was the true beginning of the house's life. The instant when ambition collided with reality, and when the mansion's uneasy nature first became impossible to deny. The first structure built on this land was never meant to be forgotten, yet it vanished almost completely from official memory. Before Winfield Hall existed in its monumental form, a more restrained residence stood here, marking the initial attempt to claim the coastline and transform it into something orderly and prestigious. It was solid, expensive, and considered temporary only in the sense that it was meant to be improved later. No one expected it to disappear overnight. The fire began quietly and spread with unsettling precision. There were no dramatic explosions, no immediate alarm that could stop what followed. By the time the flames were visible from a distance, the building was already lost. Witnesses later noted how selectively the structure was consumed, as if certain sections were targeted, while others collapsed afterward, weakened and hollow. The destruction felt fast but deliberate, leaving behind scorched stone, twisted metal, and a silence that lingered long after the embers cooled. Investigations produced no satisfying answers. Possible causes were listed, then quietly abandoned. The records remained cautious, almost reluctant to assign responsibility. What mattered was not what ignited the fire, but what the fire accomplished. In a single night, it erased the past plan entirely and cleared the site more effectively than months of demolition ever could have. The land was reset, stripped of compromise, ready for something far more extreme. What followed was not hesitation, but escalation. Instead of stepping back, the owners interpreted the loss as a challenge. The destruction was reframed not as a warning, but as an invitation to build something that could not be ignored, something that would overwhelm uncertainty through sheer presence. The ruins were not treated as a mistake to be buried. They became the silent justification for everything that came next. Stone foundations were laid directly over scorched ground. Charred remnants were removed only where absolutely necessary, leaving traces embedded beneath new layers of construction. Symbolically and physically, the future mansion would rise from what had been erased. This decision altered the character of the project. Winfield Hall was no longer simply a residence in planning. It became a response to loss, shaped by defiance rather than balance. Those overseeing the new design spoke in terms of endurance and permanence. Yet the urgency behind their decisions suggested something else. A need to prove that ambition could not be undone. Practical concerns were pushed aside. Exposure to wind, salt air, and unstable conditions were acknowledged but dismissed. If the land resisted, the building would confront it directly. From that moment on, every wall, every corridor, every towering facade carried the weight of what had burned before. Winfield Hall did not emerge gently or logically. It rose as a contradiction, built where something had already failed, daring the environment and common sense alike. The fire had cleared the space, but it also set the tone. This house would not grow naturally from the land. It would stand against it. Construction began with a tempo that stunned even experienced builders. What was planned for years elsewhere was compressed here into months. Work continued day and night, transforming the coastline into a permanently illuminated zone. Powerful floodlights cut through the darkness, making the site visible from far offshore. The mansion did not slowly emerge. It advanced, layer by layer, like a campaign that could not afford to pause. Hundreds of workers were brought in simultaneously, their tasks divided with near-military precision. Shifts overlapped, materials arrived on strict schedules, and delays were treated as unacceptable failures rather than logistical issues. The goal was not refinement, but speed. Winfield Hall was being assembled under pressure, as if time itself were an opponent that needed to be overwhelmed before it could interfere again. This intensity shaped the character of the building. Decisions were made quickly and rarely revisited. Walls went up before surrounding elements were fully resolved, and decorative features were installed, while structural work continued nearby. The house was not allowed to breathe during its creation. Instead of adapting as it grew, it followed a rigid plan enforced by urgency. That urgency left no room for softness. Observers described the site less as a home in progress and more as a fortified zone. Security was tight, access was limited, and the scale of machinery dominated the landscape. Cranes moved constantly, stone was lifted in massive sections, and the rhythm of construction never truly stopped. Even the sea seemed pushed back by the noise and light, reduced to a backdrop rather than an influence. The architecture reflected this mindset. The exterior emphasized mass and symmetry, not intimacy. Windows were positioned high and wide, designed to command views rather than invite them. The walls were thick, the entrances ceremonial, and the proportions deliberately overwhelming. This was not a place meant to offer shelter in the ordinary sense. It was meant to project control. Nowhere was this clearer than in the emerging interior layout. At the heart of the mansion, a vast central hall began to take shape, dwarfing surrounding rooms. It was conceived not as a gathering space, but as a stage. Everything led toward it. Corridors aligned with its axis, ceilings rose dramatically as they approached it, and the structure seemed to funnel movement inward with quiet insistence. The The staircase that dominated this space was not designed for convenience. Its width, angle, and elevation suggested ceremony rather than use. Ascending it felt intentional, almost performative, as though the architecture expected an audience. This was not the logic of a family home. It was the logic of authority, hierarchy, and display. As the final elements were locked into place, it became clear that Winfield Hall had been shaped by the method of its creation. Built in a rush, under constant illumination, and with an almost combative relationship to its surroundings, the house adopted those qualities as part of its identity. It stood finished not as a refuge, but as a declaration. And soon, the reason for such a monumental central space would become impossible to ignore. The staircase was conceived as the emotional center of the entire mansion. Costing an amount that alone could finance several grand homes, it was built from rare pink marble and placed where it could not be avoided. Anyone entering the house was inevitably drawn toward it. This was not an architectural accent. It was a deliberate focal point, designed to control movement, attention, and mood from the very first steps inside. At a distance, the staircase appeared elegant and ceremonial, but proximity changed the perception. Its scale was slightly exaggerated, its incline subtly steeper than expected. The width forced slow, measured movement, discouraging casual ascent. Instead of inviting, it demanded composure. People instinctively lowered their voices near it, adjusted posture, and became more aware of themselves, as if stepping into a space where behavior was being silently evaluated. The choice of color played a crucial role. Pink marble suggested softness and luxury, yet here it felt cold and emotionally distant. Light reflected off the polished surface in a way that flattened depth, making the staircase seem longer and higher than it actually was. Shadows gathered beneath each step, creating a visual rhythm that pulled the eye upward while simultaneously producing a sense of constraint. It was a contradiction, beauty paired with discomfort. Architecturally, the staircase did not simply connect floors, it divided the house psychologically. Standing at its base, one felt exposed, framed by open space and towering vertical lines. From above, the view downward emphasized hierarchy, reinforcing the idea that elevation here was not just physical, but symbolic. The design echoed ceremonial staircases found in palaces and state buildings, where ascent marked status rather than destination. This effect was intentional. The staircase was meant to impress visitors, but also to unsettle them, just enough to establish dominance. It set the emotional tone for the entire interior. Beyond it, rooms unfolded with increasing complexity, but none erased the first impression created here. Instead of relief, moving deeper into the house amplified the tension introduced at the entrance. The staircase also functioned as a filter. Those who felt comfortable within its scale and presence moved forward with confidence. Others sensed an invisible pressure, a subtle reminder that this space was not neutral. It belonged to power, order, and control. Comfort was secondary, almost irrelevant. As guests passed beyond the staircase and into the grand halls, the architecture grew more elaborate, yet less welcoming. Decorative richness increased, but warmth did not. The house began to reveal its true nature, not through hidden corridors or secret rooms, but through an atmosphere that grew heavier with each step inward. What seemed grand at first gradually became oppressive, hinting that behind the ceremonial spaces lay something far less decorative and far more unsettling. Stone and metal defined nearly every surface of the interior. Walls were not framed in the traditional way, ceilings were not softened by wood, and floors did not offer warmth underfoot. The house was assembled without conventional fasteners, relying instead on massive interlocking elements, clamps, and hidden metal joints. This method was chosen not for comfort, but for permanence. The goal was to create an interior that would not age, bend, or absorb traces of human presence. The absence of wood changed everything. Sound traveled differently here, bouncing cleanly off hard surfaces and returning slightly delayed, stripped of softness. Footsteps echoed longer than expected, voices carried farther than intended, and even quiet movements seemed amplified. Silence was never truly silent, it had weight, shaped by reflection rather than absorption. The house listened as much as it spoke. Temperature remained constant, but not in a comforting way. The stone retained coldness even during warmer months, creating a subtle but persistent sensation against skin and clothing. Air felt dense, unmoving, as if circulation had been calculated for efficiency rather than ease. The environment discouraged relaxation. One became aware of posture, movement, and breath, as though entering a controlled chamber rather than a residence. There was also a distinct scent, or rather the absence of one. No wood, fabric, or organic material meant no familiar smells. Instead, the air carried a neutral mineral sharpness, clean yet sterile. It reinforced the impression that the house was sealed off from time, resistant to decay but also to life. The building did not adapt to its occupants. Occupants were expected to adapt to it. Visually, the effect was equally severe. Polished marble surfaces reflected light with precision, creating clarity without warmth. Metal details emphasized edges and transitions, making every corner feel deliberate and final. There was little softness to rest the eye on. The interior demanded attention without offering comfort in return. This design created a paradox. The house was monumental and expensive, yet emotionally distant. It felt less like a place to live and more like a preserved object, frozen in an ideal state that could not tolerate change. Human presence felt temporary, almost intrusive, within such an environment. And yet, within this stone enclosure, one space broke the pattern. Hidden behind layers of cold symmetry was a room designed to be heard rather than felt. While the rest of the house absorbed attention through scale and material, this space communicated through vibration and sound. It was the musical room, and within the logic of Winfield Hall, it spoke louder than any wall or staircase ever could. The musical room was designed around a single presence that dominated the entire mansion, the Aeolian organ. It was not treated as an instrument placed inside the house, but as a system integrated into its very structure. Pipes ran through walls, floors, and ceilings, disappearing into hidden cavities and emerging in unexpected places. When the organ was activated, sound did not stay confined to one room. It traveled through stone and metal, spreading vibrations across the building as if the house itself were responding. The effect was physical as much as auditory. Floors subtly trembled, walls resonated, and even distant rooms felt alive with low-frequency movement. This was not background music meant to soften the space. It was immersive and unavoidable. The sound filled every corridor and chamber, creating the impression that the mansion had acquired a pulse. Visitors described the sensation as standing inside a vast body, where vibrations replaced breath and rhythm substituted for heartbeat. Acoustically, the house had been prepared for this. Hard surfaces amplified resonance, turning the entire structure into a sounding chamber. Notes lingered longer than expected, overlapping and blending into one another until direction became difficult to identify. The source of the sound seemed everywhere at once. One could not escape it by closing doors or moving away. The organ unified the house into a single, responsive entity. Emotionally, the experience was unsettling. The music was majestic, yet impersonal. It carried authority without intimacy, presence without warmth. The house seemed awake, but not aware, alive, but without empathy. The vibrations suggested motion, yet the stone environment remained cold and unmoved. This contradiction produced a subtle discomfort, as though the building imitated life without understanding it. The choice to install such an instrument was deliberate. It reinforced the idea that Winfield Hall was meant to be felt rather than inhabited. The organ did not serve its occupants. It defined them. Anyone inside became part of its resonance, absorbed into the building's internal rhythm. Silence, when the organ stopped, felt even heavier, as though something essential had withdrawn. In this room, the house revealed its most convincing illusion of vitality. It could speak, vibrate, and dominate the senses. Yet that vitality only emphasized the absence at its core. Beyond this chamber of sound lay a space even more revealing, one that stripped away performance and exposed the private center of the mansion. The owner's bedroom, where the house no longer performed but observed. The private chamber of the owner was conceived not as a place of rest, but as a statement. Every proportion, every material choice, every decorative element was modeled after an imperial bedroom in France, copied with obsessive precision. This was not inspiration, it was replication. The space was intended to recreate authority, legacy, and dominance within the most intimate zone of the house. Comfort was secondary, almost irrelevant. The bed itself dominated the room like a ceremonial object. Elevated, framed by heavy stone and metal elements, it resembled a platform rather than furniture. The layout forced attention toward it from every angle, reinforcing its symbolic role. Curtains, textiles, and ornamentation echoed imperial aesthetics, but stripped of warmth. Instead of softness, they conveyed rigidity. Instead of privacy, they projected control. Light entered the room reluctantly. Windows were positioned high and filtered through thick materials, muting daylight and flattening shadows. Artificial lighting emphasized symmetry and structure rather than atmosphere. The result was a space that felt permanently staged, as if waiting for an audience that never arrived. Even when occupied, the room resisted intimacy. It demanded presence without offering refuge. The psychological effect was subtle but persistent. Sleeping here meant inhabiting a role rather than relaxing into oneself. The scale of the room diminished the individual within it. The echoes of footsteps, the cold touch of stone, and the weight of historical imitation combined to create distance between the occupant and the space. The bedroom did not respond to human needs. It imposed an identity shaped by ambition and comparison. This imitation carried a deeper tension. By copying a foreign imperial ideal, the room embedded an unresolved conflict into the architecture itself. It celebrated power borrowed from another time and place, turning personal space into a shrine to external validation. Instead of grounding the owner, it reinforced insecurity, transforming the most private room into a constant reminder of unattainable ideals. As the mansion expanded outward, this pattern repeated. Rooms grew larger, ceilings rose higher, materials became more extravagant, yet livability diminished. Spaces were designed to impress rather than function, to declare status rather than support daily life. The house accumulated grandeur while losing purpose. Movement through the mansion became increasingly ceremonial. Ordinary actions required navigation through vast, echoing chambers that offered no sense of ease. The building rewarded observation, not habitation. It became clear that Winfield Hall was not evolving into a home. It was becoming an object, monumental, flawless, and increasingly detached from the simple act of living. The mansion contained dozens of rooms, yet very few of them ever felt occupied in a meaningful sense. Spaces unfolded one after another with impressive scale and flawless execution, but they lacked signs of routine life. These rooms were arranged for movement and display, not for staying. Chairs were positioned as if awaiting visitors who never arrived. Tables stood untouched, and corridors stretched on, without leading toward anything intimate or personal. The house was complete, yet unused, like a stage set after the performance had been canceled. The great halls amplified this emptiness. Sound behaved strangely, traveling farther than expected, and returning distorted, stripped of direction. A single step could echo through multiple rooms, lingering long enough to suggest someone else was present, even when no one was. Mirrors multiplied space endlessly, reflecting arches, staircases, and doorways until the boundaries of rooms dissolved. Orientation became difficult. One could walk through the house and lose any clear sense of scale, unsure whether the space was expanding or repeating itself. Air moved freely, but without purpose. Drafts passed through halls and stairwells, carrying shifts in temperature that felt unplanned, almost organic. Curtains stirred where no windows were open. Doors closed softly on their own, not abruptly enough to startle, but often enough to be noticed. The house never felt still. It seemed to circulate emptiness the way other homes circulate warmth. Light added to the illusion. Daylight entered in fragments, broken by high windows and reflective surfaces. It created bright zones that abruptly gave way to shadow, exaggerating distance and depth. At night, artificial lighting carved out isolated islands of visibility, leaving entire wings submerged in darkness. The mansion appeared larger after sunset, as if rooms multiplied when unobserved. Despite its scale, the house resisted long-term presence. Staying there felt temporary, even intrusive. The architecture did not support routine, and routine could not take root. Meals felt ceremonial, rest felt performative, and silence felt monitored rather than peaceful. Guests came and left, impressed but unsettled, unable to explain why the house felt unsuitable for living, despite its luxury. Over time, the mansion acquired the character of a museum, immaculate, preserved, and emotionally distant. Objects remained exactly where they were placed, untouched by habit or familiarity. The house seemed designed to be seen occasionally, not inhabited continuously. It was complete in form, but empty in function. This condition persisted quietly until an event disrupted the controlled stillness. It was only after this turning point that the house began to feel truly different, not merely empty, but altered. What followed did not originate in architecture alone, but in absence. And it was then that the most unsettling qualities of the mansion finally surfaced. The first sign that the house had crossed an invisible boundary appeared quietly and almost by accident. In one of the main halls, above a monumental fireplace, a carved stone crest had been placed as a symbol of lineage and continuity. The figures were executed with extreme care, their features idealized and frozen in stone. For years, the emblem drew little attention, blending into the overall excess of decoration that defined the mansion. Then a fracture appeared. It was not a large break, nor did it threaten the structure of the carving. A thin line ran across the face of one of the figures, passing directly through the eyes and cheek with unsettling precision. What made it impossible to ignore was not the damage itself, but its placement. The resemblance to one of the owner's daughters was impossible to dismiss once it was noticed. Whether intentional or coincidental, the likeness had always been there. The crack simply forced people to see it. Stone specialists were consulted. Natural settling was suggested. Temperature shifts were blamed, and internal stress within the material was cited as the most likely explanation. Yet none of these explanations accounted for why the rest of the carving remained untouched. The fracture did not spread outward. It did not affect surrounding elements. It isolated the face alone, as if selecting it. Attempts were made to repair the damage, but the decision was postponed again and again. There was hesitation, an unspoken reluctance to interfere. The crack became a point of fixation. Visitors stopped in front of the fireplace longer than intended. Conversations slowed or changed direction. Eyes returned to the same line in the stone, tracing it unconsciously. Soon, interpretation replaced explanation. Some suggested it was a warning embedded into the house itself, a visible flaw breaking through controlled perfection. Others whispered that the mansion was responding to events beyond its walls, reflecting internal tensions outward through stone. The crest, once a symbol of stability, became a mirror for unease. After this moment, perception of Winfield Hall shifted. Small irregularities that had once been dismissed began to accumulate meaning. Sounds were interpreted differently. Drafts felt intentional. Reflections in mirrors seemed to linger. The house was no longer just cold or empty. It was observant. Stories circulated quietly at first, then with growing confidence. The mansion was discussed not only as an architectural marvel, but as a place marked by signs. The cracked crest became the reference point for everything that followed. It offered a beginning to a narrative people were already prepared to believe. From that moment on, Winfield Hall was no longer judged solely by its design or history. It entered another category entirely, a place where stone could fracture selectively, and where meaning seemed to emerge not from intention, but from coincidence too precise to ignore. At first, the stories sounded ordinary and easily explained. Staff members mentioned unfamiliar sounds at night, soft and distant, as if someone were moving through corridors that should have been empty. These accounts did not describe anything dramatic. The sounds were subtle, almost cautious, appearing more like the residue of activity than activity itself. Footsteps were heard where no one was walking, not loud enough to alarm, but distinct enough to register. Voices followed a similar pattern. They were never clear, never direct, and never traceable to a specific location. Words could not be identified, only tone. Sometimes the sound resembled a murmur, other times a drawn-out exhalation, barely louder than the natural noise of the house settling. What unsettled listeners was consistency. These sounds repeated under similar conditions, most often during quiet hours, and often in the same sections of the mansion. Other sensations joined the reports. Certain rooms carried sudden shifts in scent that had no visible source. A faint metallic sharpness appeared in hallways, while elsewhere the air suggested something warmer, almost personal, as if a presence had recently passed through. These impressions did not linger long, but they arrived without warning and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind confusion rather than certainty. Music became part of the narrative as well. Distant notes were reported late at night, faint and indistinct, as though coming from deep within the structure. The sound did not resemble active performance, but rather memory, like vibrations returning through stone long after the source had gone silent. Those who heard it described difficulty pinpointing direction, as if the sound was not traveling through space in a normal way. What connected these early accounts was not fear, but unease. No single incident was strong enough to stand alone. Together, however, they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. The house seemed to generate impressions rather than events, sensations rather than confrontations. It did not announce itself. It suggested. As these stories accumulated, attention gradually shifted away from architecture and symbolism toward the people who occupied the space. The mansion was no longer the sole focus. Something else was unfolding within its walls, something that did not belong to rumor or interpretation. The most profound turning point would not arrive as a whisper or a shadow, but as a real and irreversible event, grounded in the physical world rather than the unseen. The room known as Marie Antoinette's chamber occupied a peculiar position within the mansion. It was not located in a remote wing, nor hidden deep within service corridors. Instead, it sat uncomfortably close to frequently used passages, making its presence impossible to forget once its reputation began to form. Architecturally, it followed the same imperial logic as other ceremonial spaces, yet something about its proportions felt compressed, as though the room had been tightened inward. The walls were finished with the same attention to detail as the rest of the house, but they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even during the day, the room appeared dimmer than surrounding spaces. Sound behaved differently here as well. Voices felt muted, while faint noises from outside the room seemed to intensify once the door was closed. The sensation was not of isolation, but of enclosure, as if the space sealed itself off from the rest of the house. Reports associated with this room followed a consistent theme. Staff and students who passed nearby described hearing subdued sobbing, often late in the evening or during moments of low activity in the mansion. These sounds were never abrupt or violent. They were described as restrained, repetitive, and deeply personal, as though grief itself were being contained within the walls. Attempts to locate the source always failed. Opening the door changed nothing. The sound did not grow louder, nor did it stop entirely. It simply faded. What disturbed witnesses most was the absence of any visible cause. The room contained no instruments, no mechanical systems, and no structural elements that could reasonably produce such effects. Investigations were conducted quietly and without publicity. Acoustics were measured, surfaces were inspected, and ventilation was examined. Each review concluded with no definitive explanation, yet none could dismiss the experiences outright. Over time, the room began to influence behavior. People avoided lingering near it. Tasks were reassigned, routes were altered, and the door remained closed more often than open. The decision to restrict access came gradually, framed as a practical measure rather than an acknowledgement of anything unusual. Officially, the room was preserved. Unofficially, it was avoided. The name itself carried weight. By associating the chamber with a historical figure whose life was defined by isolation, loss, and public spectacle, the room acquired an emotional context that amplified every sensation. Whether intentional or not, the reference shaped interpretation. The space became a container for projected sorrow, a place where emotion seemed to gather rather than dissipate. As efforts were made to reintroduce life into the mansion through new occupants and functions, this room resisted integration. Activity elsewhere did not soften its presence. Instead, contrast sharpened it. Laughter in distant halls made the silence near the chamber feel heavier. Movement throughout the house emphasized how still this space remained. The mansion could be maintained, repurposed, and populated, but it could not be fully awakened. The more energy introduced into its corridors, the clearer its resistance became. Nowhere was that resistance more evident than in this sealed room, where the house seemed to refuse participation, holding on to something unresolved while the rest of the building moved on around it. As years passed, Winfield Hall remained structurally intact, yet increasingly disconnected from everyday life. Ownership changed hands, intentions shifted, and plans were announced, but none of them took root. The mansion stood complete in every technical sense, preserved by its own durability, yet devoid of a stable human presence. Rooms remained furnished but unused, corridors were cleaned but rarely walked, and windows looked out over the same landscape without witnessing routine or familiarity. Attempts to settle into the house followed a predictable pattern. Initial enthusiasm gave way to discomfort, then to withdrawal. Occupants spoke of difficulty establishing habits, sleep felt shallow, time passed unevenly, and the scale of the space overwhelmed ordinary routines. Tasks that felt simple elsewhere required ceremony here. Daily life never quite aligned with the architecture, as though the building resisted being absorbed into repetition. The perfection of the mansion contributed to its isolation. Nothing invited adaptation. Walls were too monumental to adjust, layouts too rigid to personalize, materials too final to modify casually. The house preserved its original vision with relentless clarity. In doing so, it denied its inhabitants the ability to leave a trace. Without that exchange, living became performative rather than natural. Gradually, Winfield Hall assumed the character of an architectural shadow. It existed visibly and impressively, yet without substance and lived experience. Visitors walked through it with reverence rather than ease. Silence dominated even during occupied periods, broken only by movement echoing against stone. The mansion functioned as a reference point rather than a residence, admired from a distance but unsuitable for sustained presence. This condition forced a reevaluation. The house had been built not to shelter life, but to preserve an idea. It was a monument to aspiration, control, and permanence, frozen at the moment of its creation. As a monument, it succeeded. As a home, it failed repeatedly. Recognition of this truth arrived slowly, not as revelation, but as resignation. Eventually, the only way forward was to alter its role entirely. To keep the structure relevant, it had to be detached from the expectations of private living. This shift marked the first true break in the mansion's identity. By changing its function, those responsible hoped to neutralize what made it resistant. The house would no longer be asked to behave like a home. In this transformation, Winfield Hall was not destroyed or diminished. It was repurposed. Yet even this change carried tension, because altering purpose did not erase memory. The building remained what it had always been at its core. The attempt to redefine it was in itself an admission that the mansion could not be lived in without first being fundamentally broken. When the decision was made to turn the mansion into a school, it marked the most radical shift in the life of the building. The change was not symbolic or cosmetic. It cut directly through the logic on which Winfield Hall had been created. Spaces designed for ceremony were divided, reassigned, and stripped of their original meaning. Grandeur was not celebrated anymore. It was managed, contained, and, in many ways, neutralized. The organ was silenced first. Its pipes remained embedded in the structure, but its voice was no longer permitted to fill the house. What had once unified the building through vibration was reduced to silent architecture. Without sound, the mansion felt heavier, as though a vital function had been intentionally suppressed. The absence was noticeable even to those who had never heard it played. Large halls were subdivided into classrooms. Temporary walls interrupted long sightlines, breaking symmetry and dissolving hierarchy. Where movement had once been orchestrated, it became practical. Students walked through spaces never intended for routine, their presence eroding the formality of the architecture through repetition. Desks replaced ceremonial furniture. Chalk dust settled on stone that had been polished to intimidate. The imperial bedroom underwent a particularly striking transformation. The room that had once served as a private altar to borrowed power was reduced to a functional living space. Its scale remained, but its meaning was dismantled. Personal objects replaced symbolic ones. The architecture no longer dictated behavior. It was ignored. In this neglect, the room lost its dominance. This degradation was not accidental. It was necessary. By forcing the mansion into everyday use, its oppressive character weakened. Life introduced disorder, noise, and inconsistency. The building, so resistant to adaptation, began to accommodate through surrender. Ironically, this was the first time it truly functioned within human rhythm. Yet the process came at a cost. The house survived, but not intact. Its identity fractured. Layers of improvisation covered original intent without erasing it. The monument remained beneath the institution, and the tension between them never fully resolved. The building tolerated its new role, but it did not embrace it. Even as classrooms filled and schedules imposed order, traces of the old presence persisted. Certain corridors remained avoided, certain rooms never quite integrated. The architecture continued to assert itself subtly, reminding occupants that this was not a neutral space shaped for learning, but a structure repurposed under necessity. The transformation prolonged the life of the mansion, but it did not change its trajectory. The school function postponed abandonment, not erased it. Beneath the daily routine, the building retained its original weight, waiting for the moment when even this imposed purpose would no longer be enough to keep it anchored. The irony of the 2015 fire was impossible to ignore. Winfield Hall had been conceived as a structure immune to time and damage, built almost entirely from stone and metal, celebrated for its resistance to decay. Wood had been deliberately minimized, traditional vulnerabilities engineered out. For decades, this feature was cited as proof of the mansion's superiority, its claim to permanence, and yet, it was this very building that would once again face destruction by flame. The outbreak itself was swift and disorienting. It did not engulf the entire structure, nor did it spread indiscriminately. Instead, it concentrated, moving through internal systems and sealed spaces where fire was never expected to thrive. Smoke traveled faster than flame, filling corridors and rooms that had been designed to resist intrusion. The house, once thought impervious, revealed its hidden weaknesses. What made the event particularly unsettling was its focal point. The area most affected was the former imperial bedroom, the space that had embodied the mansion's psychological core. Its architectural self-image suffered the greatest damage. Walls were scorched, finishes blackened, and surfaces that once projected authority were stripped down to exposed structure. It was not the most practical room that burned, but the most symbolic one. Investigators pointed to technical causes, to wiring and unforeseen vulnerabilities created during decades of repurposing. Each explanation made sense on paper, yet the pattern felt too precise to dismiss emotionally. The fire did not attack the building at random. It marked a center, a space that had defined identity more than function. For those familiar with the mansion's history, the event felt like a reversal. The house that had been designed to dominate nature was now exposed as fragile. Its confidence, embedded in material choices and monumental scale, collapsed in a matter of hours. The fire did not destroy Winfield Hall, but it stripped away its claim to invulnerability. Afterward, the building stood altered. Repairs could address physical damage, but not the narrative shift that had occurred. The mansion was no longer discussed as an engineering triumph or a preserved artifact. It became a symbol of excess, of defiance, and of the limits of control. From that moment on, Winfield Hall existed more in memory and interpretation than in daily use. The fire crystallized its story into something larger than architecture. What remained was not just a structure, but a cautionary form, shaped as much by ambition and contradiction as by stone and metal. Winfield Hall now exists in a state that feels final, even though the structure still stands and its walls remain intact. It no longer belongs fully to the past, yet it resists becoming part of the present. Time moves around it rather than through it. The mansion has settled into a role it was always approaching, but never meant to acknowledge, that of a solitary monument, detached from the life that once justified its creation. Viewed today, the building reads differently than it once did. Its scale no longer signals triumph, but isolation. What was intended as authority now appears defensive. The rigid symmetry, the weight of stone, and the absence of warmth reflect a mindset defined by control rather than connection. In this sense, Winfield Hall has become a mirror, not only of its original owners, but of an era that believed permanence could be engineered through excess. Modern observers do not see a home when they look at the mansion. They see a frozen idea, the belief that status can replace belonging, that scale can substitute for intimacy, and that materials can compensate for absence of human rhythm. The house demonstrates how quickly grandeur loses meaning when it is not balanced by adaptability and care. Luxury, when stripped of everyday life, becomes sterile. What makes Winfield Hall resonate today is not mystery or rumor alone, but recognition. Its emptiness echoes contemporary anxieties about accumulation, visibility, and legacy. It reflects a culture that often builds outward while neglecting inward connection. The mansion does not accuse directly, it simply stands, allowing interpretation to do the work. Despite everything that has happened, the structure endures. Its walls still hold, its form remains unmistakable, and its presence continues to command attention. Yet it does so without inviting occupation. The building has completed its transformation from residence to symbol, from living space to silent commentary. Winfield Hall does not collapse, nor does it disappear. It remains visible, massive, and unresolved. But it stands not as a palace of achievement. It stands as a reminder that no amount of stone, metal, or ambition can replace the simple human elements that turn space into shelter. In that stillness, the mansion fulfills its final function, not as a home, but as a warning made permanent,